So one afternoon I was walking through Toronto, through Chinatown, and the streets were all packed full, and I don't know why, but Toronto inspires walking, and everybody walks, fast and focused. It's kind of commuting time, and everyone's walking around getting their errands done, running off to streetcars or picking up things from various stands, and yet we all kind of felt packed close together, and yet we kind of felt anonymous. Have you had that experience? It's like you're so close to so many people, and yet there's a deeply alone, anonymous feeling. And I was that way too. I was busy storming along my way and working over my to-do list and thinking about the things I had to accomplish. But then I became aware of something different around me. And there was this man sort of slipping through the crowd, just slipping back and forth, and he was saying, "I'm invisible." "You can't see me." And he was just moving around. "I'm invisible. You can't see me." And everyone's going, he's going, and he got right over to my ear, right where he was, slipped by me, and I turned around and I said, "I can see you." And he smiled at me and he winked. And he didn't say a word, but it was kind of conspiratorial. He was sort of like, "Don't tell anyone." And then just went off. "I'm invisible. You can't see me." There's something about sight here, isn't there? Something about how we see, what we see, when we see it. I want to take us back to Psalm 23 for a minute, because there's a line in Psalm 23 that I keep thinking about, and somehow I saw it anew today in light of the other scriptures that we're reading. And it's that God will make a banquet for us in the presence of our enemies. Have you ever thought about what that means? I will make a banquet for you in the presence of your enemies. Probably one way, I don't know that I've thought of it, it never seemed quite right to me, but part of it seems like, well, God will take care of me, right? And even in the worst face of my worst enemy, God will make me a lovely meal, and my bad enemy will starve and be hungry looking at me jealously, right? There's part of us probably that would feel good on some days, right? But I can't imagine that that's really what God is saying. It's not my experience of God, so I think, what is God saying? God will make a banquet for me in the presence of my enemies. I think it means something else, like God will treat us with love and just lavish dignity in the presence of those who cannot see us. I began to think that maybe enemies are simply people who cannot see us. People who don't see the truth of our dignity, people who don't know the wholeness of who we are. Basically, people who don't see our heart, as God says to Samuel, who's looking for King David. God is the one who sees the heart. God sees David's heart, right? He teaches Samuel how to be patient and to not just look at the surface, but to look at the heart, to choose the right next king for Israel. And so I think maybe really an enemy is simply someone who doesn't see our heart, and therefore they can hurt us. They can harm us. And then I started to think, could we be enemies of ourselves sometimes? What if we can't see our own dignity? What if we can't see our own profound child of Godness? And so what does God do? God makes a banquet, invites us to a table with ourselves, with one another, and invites us to see each other. I will make you a banquet in the presence of your enemies. The people outside that can't see us, maybe the parts of us in us that can't see ourselves. I will make you a banquet. I used to have this thought. Have you ever had this thought? I'm a good judge of people. I've worked with people a lot, my whole life. My whole work life since I was about 12, I've worked with people. And I'm a pretty good judge of people. But basically, I don't believe that's true anymore. I don't know, you go through a phase where you feel like you're in control and you know what's going on, and then it just all gets dismantled. And my notion that I'm a good judge of people has been utterly dismantled. I'm slowly giving up the idea that I can judge people at all, that I can look at somebody and figure out what their potential is or what God could possibly do with them. More and more, I find I'm putting a limiting thought on another person that has nothing to do with what God can do in that person. God does amazing things in people all the time that I could never imagine, and I have a pretty wild imagination. And God continually exceeds what's possible for people. I've been wrong so much that I've been working on a little discipline of just noticing when I'm putting a limiting thought on another person, when I'm thinking that person can only do X, or that person is this kind of a person, or that person is mentally ill, or that person will never walk again. I don't know, whatever it is, any sort of limiting thought, or a person wants to achieve something. And should I have a limiting thought that says they can't do that? I don't want to be a judge of people anymore, I'm not a good judge of people. God is a good judge of people. God knows exactly what we can do right now, what we can be, what we can accomplish, what we can experience. How do we leave space for that? For me, part of it is just slowly, I can't erase the limiting thoughts, but I can say, hey, look, there's a limiting thought. I don't think that's from God. I don't know, doing that for ourselves is probably the second half of that challenge, I think. Can I stop having limiting thoughts about what's possible for me? Do you have limiting thoughts about what's possible for you? Who you are, what you can do? An inner enemy limiting you who can't see the fullness of you? John likes images of light and dark, right? John also likes images of spirit and matter. John's really into incarnation, right? Starts with the Word made flesh. John also likes reversals. And so this story that I told you here from the Gospel has all of this, light and dark, spirit and matter, reversal, right? First of all, you get the reversal. It's the ones who can see, the Pharisees that are blind, right? They have so many limiting thoughts about this blind man that they can't see what God has done in him. And the blind man is the one who can see, and he sees so beautifully and so simply and so humbly, which I really like about that. He doesn't really know who Jesus is, and he doesn't just suddenly pretend to know. He kind of says, well, I know I was blind, and now I know I see. I don't really know who the guy is, who are you? But he's curious, who are you? And he also has this, the nature of the sight, the nature of seeing the full equality, the fundamental nature of sight is seeing the full dignity and equality of every human being, right? This is where God is pushing us. And this guy kind of gets it, because he talks right back to the Pharisees, which is completely shocking to the Pharisees. He has this simple revelation of being seen, and then he has this full sense of dignity, so that when he's questioned by the Pharisees, he's in no way afraid. He doesn't overstate what happened or what he knows, and he doesn't become afraid of them and pretend it didn't happen, because they are pressing on him to conform to the existing status quo. He just simply expresses his full dignity. Jesus has seen his full dignity, and he expresses it outside of the status quo. The parents have a harder time, right? The parents are very afraid of the impact on the status quo of all of this. And they're trying to, wiggle around and figure out how not to tweak the Pharisees too much and to not have the consequences of this man totally forgetting his place in the order of society and remembering the truth of who he is. And this is what Jesus does for us. Jesus sees us. Jesus doesn't have limiting thoughts about who we are or about who this man is. The disciples ask, who sinned, him or his parents, that he was born blind? That's an interesting, Sven was talking to us about how we have to change our patterns of thinking, right? And this is where Jesus changes their pattern of thinking. Because we have that thought. We have a crisis, a struggle, a suffering, and we look back and we get our brain focused on this question. What caused this? Is this my fault? Is this somebody else's fault? What caused this suffering? And Jesus says, don't think about that. Look in a completely different place. Look at what God can do right now. Look at how this moment can reveal the glory of God to us. So it's a shift of focus. It's not answering that question. He says, don't even ask that question. Think about a different question, because asking that question puts us back in the mire. Changing our focus. What can God reveal to me right now if I were to release my limiting thoughts? Then Jesus reenacts creation, which is kind of cool. This is a spirit and matter John thing. Jesus literally goes and takes mud, and he wipes it on the guy's eyes, and then he tells him to go wash. So you have dust and you have spirit, right? So the original creation was God breathing life into dust and making man, right? Making human being. And Jesus reenacts that. He says, mud and water, which is symbolic of spirit, I am reenacting you, I am making you into a new creation. You are a new creation. There are consequences, and this is why the parents get stressed out, and I can't help thinking on April 3rd, because we're a day ahead of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., right? April 4th is the anniversary of King's assassination. And I can't help thinking about Martin Luther King's profound sense of sight. He did not have limiting thoughts about what our world could be. Right? In some sense, that's the depth of what he offered us. There was lots of organizing, there was lots of good work, but the deep gift, I think, that Martin Luther King offered us is a view of humanity without the limiting thoughts, seeing us, seeing what God could do for us and through us. Seeing is transformative in and of itself, catching the glimpse, catching the vision. Sometimes it does take a complete shift in perspective. I was talking to a colleague of mine at a conference recently. She's the pastor at Calvary Baptist Church in D.C. And she just told the story, which I thought was really hilarious and very humble. There's an essential humility to all of this, isn't there? And she said, she was talking about the search process and how she came to be at Calvary, and I was sharing a little about my search process here at Emmanuel and just what a profound experience that was of waiting and waiting and waiting until it looked right, kind of like, must have been like Samuel sitting at the dinner table of Jesse with the 7 sons and going through all 7, and God hasn't said yes yet, and there's nobody left. Who's going to be there? And having that patience to see, to listen for God, and to wait. And she said, at Calvary, what happened is they had this huge stack of resumes. And they were going through them and going through them and going through them. And just nothing seemed right. And she said the search team got so frustrated that they basically started to cry. And they got into a circle and they put their heads down and they started to pray. And in the middle of the prayer, one of the search team takes the entire stack of resumes, turns it upside down, and pulls the name off the bottom. And this was Amy, who's turned out to be an incredible pastor there, and just an amazing life for the community. But it's this just reversal, this change of perspectives, this looking at a situation in a new way. Jesus tells us our struggles are an opportunity to encounter the glory of God, to realize God's great power. I got to thinking about that and thinking about King, and I was Dick and I were talking this week, and we were talking about God's amazing power to transform creation. And I think sometimes it's hard enough to believe that in our own lives, that there's this power that we can look for that could transform the suffering of our own lives. But then we get into bigger questions. We get into questions of war and poverty and global warming and nuclear disaster. But I think even here, it's absolutely essential that we do not impose limiting thoughts, that we continue to look for the revelation of the glory of God through these situations, to expect God to show us transformation in these situations. Our focal point is so important, so important. This isn't to abdicate or to run away or to ignore. Staying deeply engaged, but not saying, who caused this sin? Why has this occurred? But to say, where is the revelation of the glory of God, and how do I stay very close to that? How can God's power come into play here? I find it helps if I remember that I am not a good judge of people, that I am not a good judge of situations, but God is. God sees the heart. Right now, God is making you into a new creation, making me into a new creation of mud and of water, of dust and of spirit. God is really making us a great banquet in the presence of all that limits us. This is the place where judgments cease, where the glory of God is revealed, where we encounter one another as equals, people of immeasurable value, of profound dignity. Let us prepare our hearts so that the shutters can fall from them, so the scales can fall from our eyes. This is why we share communion together, right? To taste this experience, to meet each other in this place, God's banquet. We'll receive communion in our pews, and please know that everyone is welcome to receive God's grace.